They said it would take 3 days. It took 2 months, and we left none alive. I should have known something was wrong when the brass kept changing the timeline. First, it was going to be a quick mop-up operation, then a week, then maybe 2. But as I crouched behind a coral outcropping on that godforsaken island, Japanese bullets snapping overhead like angry hornets, I realized we'd walked into something far worse than anyone had imagined. The date was September 15, 1944, and Peleliu was about to become our personal slice of hell. My name is Staff Sergeant Tommy Rodriguez, and I was a squad leader with the 1st Battalion, 1st Marines. We called ourselves the Old Breed, and we'd already seen our share of Pacific Island fighting, Guadalcanal, Cape Gloucester, the works. But nothing, and I mean nothing, had prepared us for what Colonel Nakagawa and his 14th Infantry Division had waiting for us on Peleliu. The morning sun painted the Coral Island orange as our Amtraks churned through the surf toward the beaches. I remember thinking how small it looked, just 6 miles long and 2 miles wide. How hard could it be to clear out a little speck of rock like that? The Navy had been pounding it for 3 straight days, and from our vantage point on the landing craft, the place looked like the surface of the moon. Rodriguez, Corporal Jimmy Chen, my radio man, had to shout over the engine noise. You see those ridges inland? They look like Swiss cheese. I followed his gaze to the jagged coral ridges that ran down the center of the island like a dinosaur spine. The naval bombardment had indeed pocked them with craters, but something about their shape made my stomach tighten. Those weren't just hills. They were natural fortresses, and I had a sinking feeling the Japanese had made good use of them. Private First Class Bobby Kowalski, barely 19 and fresh from replacement training, was green around the gills. Sarge, do you think there's still Japs alive in there after all that shelling? I should have lied to him. Should have told him what the intelligence officers had told us, that the bombing had killed most of the garrison, that we'd face maybe light resistance from scattered survivors. Instead, I looked at that kid's scared face and felt an obligation to prepare him for what my gut was telling me was coming. Kowalski, you remember what I taught you about coral? I said, checking my M1 Garand for the 100th time. It's not like sand or dirt. When you blast coral, it doesn't just disappear, it creates caves. Natural bunkers. And the Japanese, they're smart. They've had months to dig in. The kid nodded, but I could see he didn't really understand. How could he? None of us understood what Colonel Kunio Nakagawa had built on that island. The Japanese had learned from their defeats at Tarawa and Saipan. No more bonsai charges. No more dying gloriously on the beaches. This time, they were going to make us pay for every yard of coral rock. As we approached the landing beaches, I could see the other Amtraks spread out in formation. The 1st Marines were hitting the left side of the island, while the 5th Marines took the right. Behind us, the 7th Marines waited in reserve, 15,000 Marines in total. All told, we'd wrap this up in 72 hours. 2 minutes, the coxswain yelled. I looked at my squad, 8 Marines who'd followed me through hell and back. Chen with his radio, Kowalski with his wide eyes, Sergeant Mike O'Brien with his bar, Corporal Dave Washington with his flamethrower, and 4 other good men whose names I won't forget as long as I live. We'd been through everything together, and I was determined to get them all home alive. The beach was designated White Beach 1, and as our Amtrak ground up onto the coral sand, I felt that familiar tightness in my chest that came before combat. But something was different this time. The usual sounds of resistance, machine gun chatter, mortar explosions, the screams of wounded men were almost absent. It was too quiet. Move it! Move it! I shouted as we piled out of the Amtrak. Get off the beach! The first few yards were almost eerily peaceful. Our boots crunched on the coral sand, and the September heat hit us like a physical blow. The temperature was already pushing 90 degrees, and the humidity made every breath feel like drowning. But there was no incoming fire, no desperate last stands from beach defenders. Where are they, Sarge? Kowalski asked, his voice tight with nervous energy. They're here, I said, scanning the ridgeline that rose like a wall just a few hundred yards inland. They're just waiting. I was right. We'd barely made it 200 yards when all hell broke loose. The first indication something was wrong came when Washington, who was walking point, suddenly stopped and held up his fist. We all dropped to the coral, and that's when I saw them, tiny holes in the coral outcroppings, barely visible unless you knew what to look for. Gun ports. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all perfectly camouflaged and built into the natural rock formations. O'Brien whispered, "They're in the coral itself." The Japanese had done something we'd never seen before. Instead of trying to stop us on the beach, they'd let us land and then opened up from prepared positions that were literally carved into the island's bones. Machine gun nests, mortar positions, artillery emplacements, all hidden in natural caves and tunnels that our naval bombardment couldn't touch. The first burst of machine gun fire came from directly in front of us, spitting from a hole in the coral that I would have sworn was just a shadow. Kowalski yelped and rolled behind a chunk of blasted coral just as the bullets chewed up the ground where he'd been standing. "Contact front," I yelled into Chen's radio. "We've got machine guns in the coral formations." But even as I said it, I knew it was worse than that. The firing was coming from everywhere, front, sides, even from behind us. The Japanese had created a killing field, and we'd walked right into it. "Washington, can you get that flamethrower up here?" The big corporal from Detroit was already moving, his flamethrower tank bouncing on his back as he low-crawled toward the nearest gun position. But as he got within range, something happened that made my blood run cold. The machine gun fell silent, and the port seemed to seal itself up. "What the hell?" Washington called back to me. "They're mobile," I realized. "They can seal up the positions and move through tunnels." This was the genius of Nakagawa's defense. The Japanese hadn't just dug bunkers, they'd created an entire underground network. When we attacked one position, the defenders could simply seal it up and pop out somewhere else. It was like fighting ghosts. The heat was already getting to us. September in the Pacific was brutal, but Peleliu was something special. The coral reflected the sun like a mirror, and the lack of shade meant we were cooking inside our gear. I could see sweat pouring down Kowalski's face, and he'd only been on the island for 30 minutes. "Sarge," Chen was monitoring the radio traffic. "The whole beachhead is getting chewed up. The 5th Marines are taking heavy casualties, and we can't even see where the fire is coming from." I looked around at the terrain we'd have to cross. Between us and the main ridge line was about 600 yards of open ground, broken only by occasional coral outcroppings and a few scraggly trees. Every piece of cover was a potential Japanese position, and every step forward would be earned in blood. "All right, listen up," I called to my squad. "We're going to bound forward by fire teams. O'Brien, you and your barb provide covering fire. Washington, you're with me. We'll leapfrog from cover to cover and clear each position with fire and movement." It sounded good in theory. In practice, it was a nightmare. The first bound took us maybe 20 yards before we ran into another position. This one was built into what looked like a natural coral formation, but when Washington got close enough to use his flamethrower, we discovered it was actually a reinforced concrete bunker covered with coral camouflage. The flame stream bounced off harmlessly, and the machine gun inside kept chattering. "We need demolitions," I yelled back to Chen. "Get me some engineers with satchel charges." But the engineers were pinned down just like everyone else. Across the entire beachhead, the Marines were discovering the same thing we were. The Japanese had turned the island into a fortress, and every position was mutually supporting. You couldn't flank one without exposing yourself to fire from 3 others. By noon, we'd advanced maybe 200 yards, and already we'd lost 2 men. Private Jenkins took a sniper's bullet through the neck, and Corporal Martinez stepped on a mine that had been hidden under a thin layer of coral sand. Both were still alive when the corpsmen reached them, but I could see in their eyes that they knew how this was going to end. "How many Japs you think are in there?" Kowalski asked during a brief lull in the firing. I'd been wondering the same thing. Intelligence had estimated maybe 2,000 Japanese defenders, but the volume of fire we were taking suggested something much larger. What we didn't know yet was that Colonel Nakagawa had over 11,000 men on that island, and every single one of them was prepared to die rather than surrender. "Enough," I told Kowalski. "There's enough." As the afternoon wore on, the heat became almost unbearable. The temperature climbed past 100 degrees, and with the humidity, it felt like we were breathing soup. Men started dropping from heat exhaustion almost as fast as they were falling to enemy fire. Our water supplies, which were supposed to last all day, were running low by 1400 hours. "Sarge," Washington gasped, "I can't carry this flamethrower much farther. The tank's too heavy in this heat." I looked at the big corporal and saw he was right. His face was red as a beet, and he was weaving on his feet. But without the flamethrower, we had no way to clear the bunkers. "Give me the tank," I said. "You carry my rifle and take point." It was a stupid decision, but it was the only one I had. The flamethrower weighed over 60 pounds, and with the heat and humidity, it felt like twice that. But it was the only weapon we had that could reach into those coral caves and silence the guns. The next Japanese position was built into a natural chimney in the coral, about 30 feet high and perfectly camouflaged. We only found it when Kowalski spotted the muzzle flash from a sniper's rifle. The shot missed him by inches, and we all hit the deck. "There," Kowalski pointed. About halfway up that coral formation. I could barely see it, just a dark hole in the rock that could have been a natural shadow. But as I watched, I saw the brief glint of a rifle scope. "Washington, can you get behind that formation?" The corporal studied the terrain. "Yeah, but it'll take me 10 minutes to work around, and I'll be exposed the whole way." "Do it." "O'Brien, you keep that sniper's head down with the bar. Chen, call an artillery on that ridge line." "Sarge," Chen said, "artillery says they can't hit those positions without danger of hitting our own men. We're too close." That was the thing about this battle. Everything was too close. The Japanese positions were so well integrated into the natural terrain that we couldn't use our usual advantages in artillery and air support without risking our own men. It was going to be a rifleman's fight, pure and simple. Washington made his move, sprinting from cover to cover while O'Brien's bar chattered overhead. The sniper took a few shots at him but missed, and within 5 minutes, Washington was in position behind the coral formation. "Now!" I yelled, and lit up the flamethrower. The stream of burning gasoline arced through the air and splashed into the cave opening. For a moment, nothing happened. Then we heard screaming, high-pitched, desperate screaming that cut through the sound of battle like a knife. The sniper's rifle clattered down the coral face, and the screaming stopped. "One down," I muttered, but I felt no satisfaction. Just a sick feeling in my stomach and the knowledge that we had hundreds more positions to clear. By evening, we'd advanced maybe 400 yards from the beach. The cost had been horrific. My squad was down to 6 men, and across the entire beachhead, the Marines had taken over 1,000 casualties. The Japanese, meanwhile, seemed to have an endless supply of men and ammunition. "Sarge," Chen said as we set up our night perimeter, "I'm getting reports that some of the companies are down to half strength already. The 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, has lost 4 company commanders." I nodded grimly. The Japanese tactics were simple but effective. Let the Marines land, then bleed them white in the coral. Every yard we advanced cost us men we couldn't spare, and the Japanese seemed perfectly willing to trade space for time. "What's the word from regiment?" I asked. "They're sending up the 7th Marines tomorrow. The whole division is going to be committed." That was when I knew we were in trouble. The 7th Marines had been held in reserve for the next operation, but now they were being thrown into the meat grinder too. This wasn't going to be a 3-day operation. It was going to be a siege. As darkness fell, we could hear the Japanese moving through their tunnel systems. Occasionally, we'd catch glimpses of figures flitting between positions, but trying to shoot them was like trying to hit shadows. They knew every inch of this island, and we were just learning it existed. "Get some rest," I told my men. "Tomorrow's going to be worse." I was right about that too. The second day started with a Japanese artillery barrage that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The shells fell among our positions with devastating accuracy, and I realized the enemy had pre-registered every piece of ground we might use for cover. They'd been planning this defense for months. "Incoming," Kowalski screamed, and we all pressed ourselves into the coral as the shells exploded around us. The barrage lasted 20 minutes, and when it lifted, we found that 2 more companies had been effectively wiped out. The Japanese weren't just defending, they were actively trying to destroy us piece by piece. "All right, saddle up," I called to my remaining men. We're going after the ridge line. The ridge that dominated the center of the island was our main objective. Intelligence called it the Ummerbrogal Ridge, though we'd come to know it by a different name, Bloody Nose Ridge. It was a coral formation about 200 feet high and maybe half a mile long, honeycombed with caves and tunnels that had been turned into the strongest fortress any of us had ever seen. As we approached the base of the ridge, the heat was already oppressive. The coral reflected the sun like a furnace, and the lack of any wind made it feel like we were walking into an oven. Kowalski was already showing signs of heat exhaustion, and we'd only been moving for an hour. "Sarge," he gasped, "I need water." I looked at our water supplies and felt a chill despite the heat. We were already rationing, and it was only the second day. The island had no fresh water sources, and resupply was proving difficult with the Japanese artillery zeroed in on the beaches. "Make it last," I told him. "We don't know when we'll get more." The attack on the ridge began at 00 hours. 3 battalions of Marines, supported by tanks and artillery, moving against what we thought was a company of Japanese defenders. We were wrong about the numbers, dead wrong. The first indication of what we were up against came when the lead elements reached the base of the ridge. Instead of the scattered resistance we expected, they ran into a wall of fire from perfectly positioned machine guns, mortars, and artillery. The Japanese had turned every cave, every crevice, every natural formation into a fighting position. O'Brien shouted as a mortar round exploded just yards from our position. "They're in the rocks themselves." He was right. The Japanese had spent months carving fighting positions out of the coral, creating an interconnected network of tunnels and bunkers that was nearly impregnable. When we attacked one position, the defenders could simply withdraw deeper into the ridge and pop up somewhere else. Our first assault was a disaster. We got maybe 50 yards up the slope before the crossfire became too intense. Marines were dropping everywhere, and the wounded couldn't be evacuated because the Japanese had clear fields of fire over the entire approach. "Fall back," I yelled. Fall back to the base, but falling back was almost as dangerous as going forward. The Japanese had positioned snipers to cover every route, and they picked off Marines with methodical precision. Kowalski took a bullet through the shoulder during the withdrawal, and Washington had to carry him back to safety. "How bad?" I asked the corpsman who was working on Kowalski. "He'll live," the doc said, "but he's done. That shoulder's going to need surgery back on the ship." I looked at the kid, my responsibility, my failure. He was conscious and trying to look brave, but I could see the pain in his eyes. "Sarge," he whispered, "I'm sorry I let you down." "You didn't let anybody down, son," I told him. "You did your job. Now let the corpsman take care of you." As they carried Kowalski away, I felt something inside me harden. This wasn't just a battle anymore, it was personal. The Japanese had turned this island into a killing machine, and they were feeding my men into it one by one. "What's the plan, Sarge?" Chen asked. I looked up at the ridge, studying the coral formations with new eyes. The Japanese tactics were brilliant, but they had one weakness. They were tied to their positions. If we could find a way to get behind them, to cut them off from their supply tunnels, we might be able to break their defense. "We're going to try something different," I said. "Instead of going straight up, we're going to work around the sides. Find the back doors to these caves." It was easier said than done. The entire ridge was a maze of coral formations, and every path was covered by Japanese fire. But we had one advantage. The Marines who'd been fighting in the Pacific for 3 years had learned to be creative. Washington had recovered from the heat exhaustion and was back with the flamethrower. O'Brien still had his bar, and Chen was keeping us connected to the rest of the world with his radio. We were down to 5 men, but we were still functional. There, I pointed to a narrow gully that ran along the base of the ridge. If we can get into that gully, we might be able to work our way up behind their positions. The gully was barely wide enough for one man, and it was partially blocked by fallen coral. But it offered the only concealment we'd seen all day. The question was whether the Japanese had spotted it too. "I'll go first," I said. "If I draw fire, you'll know it's covered." But Chen grabbed my arm. "Sarge, that's my job. I'm the radio man. I'm expendable." "Nobody's expendable," I told him. "But I'm the squad leader, and this is my call." I slipped into the gully and immediately felt the temperature drop about 10 degrees. The coral walls provided blessed shade, and for a moment, I could almost forget we were in hell. But the feeling didn't last long. The gully was longer than I'd expected, and it curved back into the ridge like a natural corridor. After about 50 yards, it opened into a small chamber that had been carved out of the coral. And there, sitting in the shadows, was a Japanese soldier. He was young, maybe 20, and he was wounded. A piece of shrapnel had opened a gash in his leg, and he was trying to bandage it with a strip-off cloth. When he saw me, his eyes went wide with terror. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Two soldiers, two young men who'd been thrown into this hell by forces beyond their control. He was probably scared, probably homesick, probably wondering how he'd ended up in this coral tomb just like I was. Then training took over. My M1 came up, and I put 2 rounds in his chest before he could reach for his rifle. He slumped against the coral wall, and I saw his lips moving in what might have been a prayer. "Clear!" I called back to my men. "The gully's clear." But as they joined me in the chamber, I felt sick. Not from the heat or the stress, but from the knowledge that this was just the beginning. If there was one Japanese soldier in these tunnels, there were hundreds more. "Look at this," Washington said, examining the coral walls. "They've been carving these tunnels for months. Maybe years." He was right. The walls were smooth and carefully shaped, with alcoves for ammunition and supplies. This wasn't just a fighting position, it was a subterranean fortress. "Chen, can you get a signal in here?" The radio man tried his radio, but the coral walls blocked the transmission. We were on our own. "Okay, here's what we're going to do," I said. "We're going to follow this tunnel system and try to get behind their main positions. But we go slow, we go quiet, and we clear every inch." The tunnel system was more extensive than any of us had imagined. It branched and curved through the coral like a natural cave system, but every passage had been improved and reinforced by the Japanese. We found ammunition stockpiles, medical supplies, even small cooking areas where the defenders had prepared meals. "They're living down here," O'Brien whispered. "This isn't just a fighting position. It's a city." The deeper we went, the more we realized the scope of what we were facing. The Japanese hadn't just dug in, they'd created an entire underground civilization. Every tunnel connected to every other tunnel, creating a network that allowed them to move freely while we were pinned down on the surface. We'd been moving through the tunnels for about an hour when we heard voices ahead. Japanese voices, speaking in urgent, hushed tones. I held up my fist, and we all froze. "How many?" Washington whispered. I listened carefully. "At least 3, maybe 4. And they were moving our way. "Back up," I whispered. "Find a place to set up an ambush." We retreated about 20 yards to where the tunnel widened into another chamber. This one had been set up as a command post, with maps in the walls and radio equipment on a small table. But more importantly, it had multiple exits, perfect for an ambush. "Washington, you take the flamethrower and cover the main entrance. O'Brien, you and the bar cover the side passage. Chen, you watch our backs." The Japanese voices were getting closer. I could hear their footsteps echoing off the coral walls, and I realized they were moving without any attempt at stealth. They felt safe down here, in their underground kingdom. They were wrong. The first Japanese soldier entered the chamber at a quick walk, obviously familiar with the layout. He was carrying a Type 99 rifle and wearing the kind of confident expression that comes from fighting on home ground. When he saw us, that expression turned to shock, then terror. Washington's flamethrower lit up the chamber like the sun. The stream of burning gasoline caught the Japanese soldier full in the chest and sent him screaming back into the tunnel. The screaming lasted maybe 5 seconds, then stopped abruptly. The other Japanese soldiers, hearing the commotion, tried to retreat. But O'Brien was ready with the bar. The automatic rifle chattered in the confined space, and the heavy 30-6 rounds punched through the coral walls like they were paper. "Cease fire," I yelled when the shooting stopped. "Chen, check the passages. Make sure they're all down." The radio man moved to the chamber, checking each tunnel entrance. "Clear, Sarge." I count 4 enemy Kia. 4 more Japanese soldiers who would never see home again. 4 more young men who died in this coral hell because their leaders had decided to fight to the last man. I should have felt satisfaction, but all I felt was exhaustion. "Look at this," Chen said, examining the maps on the command post table. "This shows the whole tunnel system. There must be miles of passages in this ridge." The maps were in Japanese, but the topographical features were clear enough. The ridge was honeycombed with tunnels, and every major position was connected to every other position. It was like a 3-dimensional chess game, and we were just learning the rules. "Can you figure out where the main positions are?" I asked. Chen studied the maps. "I think so. There's a large chamber about 200 yards that way." He pointed deeper into the ridge. "And another one up near the top. If I'm reading this right, those are the main command bunkers. Then that's where we're going." The tunnel leading to the first command bunker was the largest we'd encountered so far. It was wide enough for 3 men to walk abreast, and the ceiling was high enough that we didn't have to crouch. The Japanese had carved this passage with care, smoothing the walls and even installing wooden supports in some places. This is their main supply route, I realized. Everything goes through here. That gave me an idea. If we could block this tunnel, we could cut off supplies to half the ridge. But it would require demolitions, and we didn't have any explosives with us. "Chen, can you raise anybody on the radio now that we're in a bigger tunnel?" The radio man tried his radio and got a crackling response. "I've got regiment, Sarge." "Weak signal, but I can hear them. Tell them we're inside the ridge and we found the supply tunnels. We need engineers with demolitions, and we need them now." While Chen worked the radio, I studied the tunnel more carefully. The Japanese had built this to last, with carefully planned ventilation shafts and drainage systems. But they'd also built it to be defended, with firing positions carved into the walls at regular intervals. "Sarge," Chen said, "regiment says they can't spare any engineers. All the demo teams are pinned down on the surface. We're on our own." I felt a surge of frustration. We'd found the key to breaking the Japanese defense, but we didn't have the tools to exploit it. Then I remembered something Washington had said about his flamethrower fuel. "Washington, how much fuel do you have left?" The big corporal checked his tanks. "About half. Maybe enough for 4 or 5 more bursts." "What happens if you shoot it into a confined space without igniting it?" Washington thought for a moment. "Well, the fuel would vaporize, and if there was an ignition source..." His eyes widened. "You want to turn this tunnel into a bomb? Can it be done?" "Maybe. If we could get the fuel to vaporize throughout the tunnel, then set it off with a grenade or something. But the timing would have to be perfect, and we'd have to be far enough away not to get caught in the blast." It was a desperate plan, but it was the only one we had. The Japanese had turned this island into a fortress, and we were going to have to fight fire with fire. "All right, here's what we're going to do," I said. "We're going to move up this tunnel until we find the main command bunker. Then we're going to set up our little surprise and get the hell out of here." The tunnel curved and branched as we moved deeper into the ridge. We passed several smaller chambers, each one set up as a fighting position or supply depot. The Japanese had been thorough in their preparations, and I realized we were seeing only a small part of their overall defense. "Contact," O'Brien whispered suddenly. "I can see movement ahead." We all froze and listened. Sure enough, there were voices coming from somewhere ahead of us. Multiple voices, speaking in urgent tones. We'd found command bunker. "How many?" I whispered. O'Brien peered around the curve in the tunnel. "I can see maybe 6 or 7. They're in a big chamber, maybe 50 yards ahead. Looks like they're having some kind of meeting." "Perfect," I said. "Washington, this is it. Can you get the fuel into that chamber without being seen?" The corporal studied the layout. "I think so. But once I start spraying, they're going to know we're here. You'll have maybe 30 seconds before they start shooting. That's all we need. O'Brien, you cover Washington. Chen, you watch our backs. As soon as Washington empties his tanks, we run like hell." Washington crept forward to the edge of the chamber and peered inside. When he came back, his face was grim. "Sarge, there's more than just soldiers in there. I can see maps, radio equipment, maybe even some kind of planning staff. I think this is their main command post for the whole ridge." "Even better," I said. "If we can take out their command structure, maybe we can break their whole defense." Washington nodded and moved back toward the chamber. The rest of us took up positions to cover his withdrawal. Then we waited. The first spray of unignited fuel was almost silent. Washington had removed the ignition system from his flamethrower, so the gasoline just sprayed out in a fine mist. But Japanese in the chamber noticed the smell immediately. "Nanda," one of them shouted. "What is that?" Washington kept spraying, moving the nozzle to cover as much of the chamber as possible. The fuel vaporized in the heat, creating an invisible cloud of death that filled the enclosed space. "Now," I yelled, and Washington threw a grenade into the chamber. We ran, all of us, as fast as we could move through the winding tunnel. Behind us, we could hear the Japanese soldiers shouting in confusion, trying to figure out what was happening. The explosion, when it came, was like nothing I'd ever experienced. The entire ridge seemed to shake, and the tunnel filled with a wall of flame that cascaded us through the passages like a living thing. The concussion knocked us all to the ground, and for a moment, I thought we'd miscalculated and killed ourselves. But when the flame died down and the smoke cleared, we were still alive. Singed, deafened, and shaken, but alive. "Holy," O'Brien gasped. "Did we just blow up half the ridge?" The explosion had done more than just destroy the command bunker. It had collapsed several tunnels and created a break in the Japanese supply line. More importantly, it had shown us that the enemy wasn't invincible. They could be beaten, but it was going to take everything we had. "Chen, can you raise regiment now?" The radio man tried his radio and got a strong signal. "I've got them, Sarge." "Clear as a bell. Tell them we've breached the ridge defenses and destroyed a major command post. Tell them we need reinforcements and resupply, and we need them now." As Chen worked the radio, I looked around at my remaining men. We were down to 4 effectives, we were low on ammunition, and we were exhausted. But we'd proven something important. The Japanese could be beaten. It was just going to cost us everything. "Sarge," Chen said, "regiment says they're sending up 2 companies of fresh Marines. ETA 30 minutes. I nodded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that 30 minutes was going to be a very long time. The reinforcements arrived just as the Japanese launched their counterattack. 2 companies of Marines from the 7th Regiment, fresh from the ships and eager for action. They had no idea what they were walking into. Sergeant Rodriguez, the company commander, was a young captain named Phillips, and he looked like he'd just graduated from officer training. "I'm told you found a way into the ridge defenses." "Yes, sir," I said, "but it's not going to be easy. The Japanese have turned this whole ridge into a fortress. Every tunnel connects to every other tunnel, and they can move around underground while we're stuck on the surface." Captain Phillips studied the coral formations with the kind of confidence that comes from never having been shot at. "My orders are to take this ridge by nightfall. Can your men guide us through the tunnel system?" I looked at my surviving squad members, Washington, O'Brien, and Chen. They were exhausted, running on adrenaline and coffee, but they were still Marines. They'd follow orders, even if those orders were impossible. "We'll try, sir. But you need to understand, this isn't like any fighting we've done before. The Japanese are dug in deep, and they're not going to give up easily." The captain nodded absently, already studying his maps. "I have 160 Marines, Sergeant. I think we can handle whatever the Japanese have left." What the Japanese had left was Colonel Nakagawa's entire 14th Infantry Division, minus the men we'd already killed. Over 10,000 soldiers, all of them prepared to die rather than surrender. The young captain was about to learn that lesson the hard way. The assault began at 1400 hours. 2 companies of Marines, supported by tanks and artillery, attacking what intelligence still insisted was a lightly defended position. The Japanese let us get about halfway up the ridge before they opened fire. The volume of fire was incredible. Machine guns, mortars, artillery, and rifle fire came from every direction. The Japanese had positioned their weapons so that every approach was covered by multiple fields of fire. Marines started dropping immediately. "Take cover," I yelled, but there was no cover. The coral had been scraped clean by our own artillery, and every rock formation was a potential enemy position. Captain Phillips lasted about 10 minutes. A Japanese sniper put a bullet through his head just as he was trying to coordinate the advance. Command fell to a lieutenant who'd been in the Pacific for exactly 3 weeks. "What do we do now?" the lieutenant asked me, his voice tight with panic. "We do what Marines do," I told him. "We adapt, we improvise, and we keep fighting." The next 6 hours were a blur of smoke, blood, and coral dust. We'd advance a few yards, get pinned down by Japanese fire, call in artillery, then advance a few more yards. The Japanese gave ground slowly, fighting for every cave, every tunnel, every inch of coral rock. The heat was killing us almost as fast as the enemy fire. By mid-afternoon, the temperature had climbed past 110 degrees, and Marines were dropping from heat exhaustion faster than they were being evacuated. Our water supplies were running dangerously low, and the corpsmen were having to choose between treating wounded men and treating heat casualties. "Sarge," Washington gasped, "I can't feel my hands anymore." I looked at the big corporal and saw the signs of severe heat exhaustion. His face was pale despite the heat, and his hands were shaking. The flamethrower was too heavy for him to carry any farther. "Give me the tank," I said. "You take my rifle and stay with the lieutenant." "But, Sarge—" "That's an order." "Marine." Washington handed over the flamethrower, and I felt the weight of it settle onto my shoulders. 60 pounds of napalm and pressure tanks, plus my own gear. In this heat, it felt like carrying a refrigerator, but we needed that flamethrower. It was the only weapon we had that could reach into the Japanese caves and silence their guns. Every bunker we'd cleared, every tunnel we'd blocked, had been done with Washington's flamethrower. "O'Brien, you're with me," I called to the bar gunner. "We're going to work our way around to the left flank." The left side of the ridge was less heavily defended, but it was also more exposed. As we moved across the coral, Japanese snipers took pot shots at us from hidden positions. O'Brien's bar chattered in response, but it was hard to tell if we were hitting anything. "There!" O'Brien pointed to a cave opening about 50 yards up the slope. "I can see movement in there." I looked where he was pointing and saw what he meant. Shadows moving in the darkness, and the occasional glint of metal. Another Japanese position, probably a machine gun nest. "Can you keep their heads down while I get close enough to use the flamethrower?" O'Brien nodded and opened up with the bar. The heavy 30-6 rounds sparked off the coral around the cave entrance, and the shadows inside disappeared. But I knew they were still there, waiting for their chance. I made my approach by bounds, using every piece of cover I could find. The flamethrower tank banged against my back with every step, and sweat poured down my face like rain. But I made it to within 30 yards of the cave before Japanese spotted me. The machine gun opened up just as I dove behind a coral outcropping. The bullets chewed up the rock inches from my head, and I could hear the Japanese soldiers shouting to each other inside the cave. "O'Brien," I yelled. "Keep them busy." The bar started chattering again, and I took my chance. I rolled out from behind the cover and triggered the flamethrower. The stream of burning gasoline arched through the air and splashed into the cave opening. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the screaming started. 2 Japanese soldiers ran out of the cave, their uniforms on fire. They stumbled across the coral, beating at flames with their hands, until they finally collapsed. The machine gun fell silent. "That's how we do it," I muttered, but there was no satisfaction in it. Just the sick knowledge that we'd have to do it again and again, cave by cave, until there was nobody left to kill. The pattern repeated throughout the afternoon. We'd spot a Japanese position, pin it down with rifle fire, then close in with the flamethrower. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes the Japanese would seal up their caves and disappear into the tunnel system, only to pop up somewhere else. By evening, we'd advanced maybe 200 yards up the ridge. The cost had been terrible. The 2 companies that had started the assault were down to maybe 60 effective men. The Japanese, meanwhile, seemed to have an endless supply of replacements. "Sarge," Chen said as we set up our night defensive positions, "I'm getting reports from all over the island. The whole operation is bogged down. Some units haven't moved at all today." I nodded grimly. This was what Nakagawa had planned all along. He wasn't trying to stop us, he was trying to bleed us to death. Every day we stayed on Peleliu, we lost more Marines. Every yard we advanced cost us men we couldn't replace. "What's the word from higher up?" I asked. Division is bringing in more reinforcements. The 5th Marines are being reinforced by elements of the 81st Infantry Division. But the scuttlebutt is that the brass is starting to worry about casualties. They should have been worrying about casualties from the beginning. We'd been on the island for 3 days, and already we'd lost more men than in some entire campaigns. The Japanese defense was more effective than anyone had imagined. Get some rest, I told Chen. Tomorrow we're going to try something different. What we tried was a night assault. The theory was that we could use the darkness to get close to the Japanese positions without being seen. The reality was that the Japanese knew their tunnel system better than we knew our own equipment. The assault began at 0200 hours. 50 Marines, moving in small groups through the coral formations. The plan was to get within grenade range of the major caves, then hit them all at once. It was a disaster. The Japanese had listening posts throughout the tunnel system, and they heard us coming long before we reached their positions. They let us get close, then opened up with everything they had. Machine guns, mortars, and rifle fire from positions we didn't even know existed. I lost O'Brien in the first 5 minutes. A Japanese grenade rolled out of a cave we thought was empty and exploded right next to his position. The bar went silent, and I knew he was gone. Fall back, I yelled into the darkness. Fall back to the base, but falling back in the dark was almost impossible. The coral formations all looked the same, and the Japanese were firing flares to illuminate our positions. Marines scattered in every direction, trying to find their way back to friendly lines. I made it back with Chen and maybe 20 other survivors. Washington was waiting for us, and I could see the question in his eyes before he asked it. O'Brien didn't make it, I said simply. Washington nodded and looked away. We'd lost another good Marine, another friend. The Japanese were killing us piece by piece, and there didn't seem to be anything we could do about it. Sarge, Chen said quietly, how many more men are we going to lose before this is over? I didn't have an answer for that. All I knew was that we were Marines, and Marines don't quit. No matter how many men we lost, no matter how long it took, we were going to take this island. The Japanese could kill us, but they couldn't make us surrender. As many as it takes, I said finally. As many as it takes. Day 7. We'd been on Peleliu for a week, and the island had become a charnel house. The coral was stained red with blood, and the air was thick with the smell of death and cordite. What was supposed to be a 3-day operation had turned into a grinding war of attrition. I was down to 2 men now, Chen and Washington. The rest of my squad was either dead or evacuated with wounds. We'd been reinforced twice, but the new men didn't last long. The Japanese had turned killing Marines into a science. Sarge, Washington said, checking his flamethrower, we're down to our last fuel tank. Maybe enough for 2 or 3 more bursts. I nodded and studied the coral formation in front of us. It was the largest cave complex we'd encountered yet, rising about 30 feet above the surrounding terrain. Intelligence called it the 5 Sisters, 5 interconnected caves that controlled the entire northern approach to the ridge. How many Japs you think are in there? Chen asked. Too many, I said. But we're going to clear it anyway. The 5 Sisters had been holding up our advance for 2 days. Every time we tried to assault it, the Japanese would drive us back with interlocking fields of fire. Machine guns, mortars, and snipers worked together to create a killing zone that no Marine had been able to cross. But I had an idea. Instead of attacking from the front, we were going to comb-meet them from below. I'd spotted a drainage tunnel that ran under the coral formation, probably carved by centuries of rainfall. If we could get into that tunnel, we might be able to come up behind the Japanese positions. You sure about this? Sarge? Washington asked as we prepared to enter the drainage tunnel. If they've got that tunnel covered, we're going to be trapped down there. They can't cover everything, I said, though I wasn't entirely convinced myself. The Japanese are good, but they're not perfect. The drainage tunnel was barely wide enough for 1 man, and it was partially filled with stagnant water and coral debris. We had to crawl through it on our bellies, pushing our weapons ahead of us. The smell was indescribable, a mixture of decay, mold, and something else I didn't want to identify. Chen whispered, "This is like crawling through a sewer." "Keep moving," I said. "We're almost there." The tunnel curved upward as we approached the cave complex, and I could see light ahead. Natural light filtered through the coral formations. We were getting close. I held up my hand for silence and listened. Voices. Japanese voices, coming from somewhere above us. They were talking in normal tones, obviously feeling secure in their positions. They had no idea we were underneath them. There, I pointed to a vertical shaft that led upward. That's our way in. The shaft was narrow and rough, carved by water over thousands of years. But it was climbable, and it led directly into the heart of the Japanese position. Washington, you go first with the flamethrower. Chen, you follow with the radio. I'll bring up the rear. Washington started climbing, his flamethrower tank scraping against the coral walls. Every sound seemed magnified in the confined space, and I was sure the Japanese would hear us coming. But the voices above continued their casual conversation. Now, I whispered when Washington reached the top of the shaft. The flamethrower burst lit up the cave like the sun. I could hear Japanese soldiers screaming in surprise and pain, and the sound of men running in panic. Washington had caught them completely off guard. Chen and I climbed up into the cave and found ourselves in the middle of a Japanese command post. Maps covered the walls, and radio equipment was scattered across several tables. But more importantly, the cave was full of ammunition and supplies. Look at this, Chen said, examining the maps. This shows the entire Japanese defense network. Every cave, every tunnel, every supply route. The maps were incredibly detailed, showing not just the physical layout of the tunnels, but also the positions of every Japanese unit. It was a complete intelligence bonanza, and it would give us the information we needed to break the enemy defense. Get on the radio, I told Chen. Tell Regiment we've captured the Japanese command post for the northern sector. Tell them we've got maps of their entire tunnel system. While Chen worked the radio, I studied the maps more carefully. The Japanese defense was even more sophisticated than we'd imagined. They'd created multiple fallback positions, each one designed to channel our attacks into predetermined killing zones. No wonder we'd been taking such heavy casualties. Sarge, Washington called from the cave entrance, I can see Japanese soldiers moving in the other caves. They know we're here. I looked outside and saw what he meant. Japanese soldiers were running between the cave openings, obviously trying to organize a counterattack. We'd stirred up a hornet's nest. How much fuel do you have left? I asked. One more good burst, maybe 2 short ones. Make them count. The Japanese counterattack came from 3 directions at once. Soldiers emerged from the other caves and began moving toward our position, using the coral formations for cover. They were disciplined and well coordinated, even in the face of our surprise attack. Washington's flamethrower caught the first group as they tried to cross the open ground between caves. The stream of burning gasoline swept across them like a scythe, and they went down screaming. But there were more coming from the other directions. Chen, tell Regiment we need immediate support. Artillery, airstrikes, anything they can give us. The radio man was already on the radio, his voice urgent. Regiment says they're sending up 2 platoons of Marines. ETA 15 minutes. 15 minutes was a long time when you were surrounded by angry Japanese soldiers. But we dealt with worse odds before. Washington, cover the main entrance. Chen, you watch the back tunnel. I'll take the side passage. The Japanese came at us in rushes, small groups of soldiers trying to get close enough to use the grenades. My M1 cracked repeatedly, and I saw enemy soldiers dropping behind the coral formations. But they kept coming. Grenade! Washington yelled, and we all hit the deck as a Japanese grenade exploded in the cave entrance. Coral fragments filled the air, and I felt something hot slice across my cheek. You hit. Sarge? Chen asked. Just a scratch, I said, though my face was bleeding freely. Keep fighting. The battle for the cave lasted maybe 10 minutes, but it felt like hours. The Japanese threw everything they had at us, but they couldn't dislodge us from our position. When the Marine reinforcements finally arrived, they found 43 dead Japanese soldiers scattered around the cave complex. Good work, Sergeant, said the company commander who'd led the relief force. These maps are going to be invaluable. We finally have a clear picture of what we're up against. What we were up against was a defense system that had been designed by a military genius. Colonel Nakagawa had created a fortress that could have held off an army, and he'd manned it with soldiers who preferred death to surrender. Breaking it was going to require everything we had. How many more Japanese are estimated to be in the ridge? I asked. The company commander studied the captured maps. Based on these positions, maybe 2,000. But they're dug in deep, and they're not going to give up easily. 2,000 Japanese soldiers, all of them prepared to die rather than surrender. And we'd already lost over 3,000 Marines trying to dig them out. The arithmetic was simple and brutal. We were going to lose more men before this was over. What are the orders? I asked. We keep attacking. Division wants this ridge cleared by the end of the week. I looked at Washington and Chen, my two remaining men. They were exhausted, running on adrenaline and stubbornness. But they were Marines, and they'd keep fighting until they couldn't fight anymore. Roger that, sir. We'll get it done. The final assault on the Ummerbrogal Ridge began on September 23rd, 8 days after we'd first landed on Peleliu. By then, the entire 1st Marine Division had been committed to the battle, along with elements of the 81st Infantry Division. Over 20,000 American troops were fighting for control of an island that was supposed to fall in 3 days. The Japanese had used every day of those 8 days to improve their defenses. They'd sealed up caves we'd already cleared, opened new firing positions, and created new tunnels. It was like fighting a hydra. Every time we cut off one head, 2 more appeared. But we'd learned their tactics and we'd adapted our own. Instead of offering to take the caves by frontal assault, we were using a combination of flamethrowers, demolitions, and sealed charges to bury the Japanese alive. It was brutal, but it worked. There's the big one, Washington said, pointing to a cave opening near the top of the ridge. That's got to be their main command post. The cave was larger than any we'd seen before, and it was positioned to command the entire ridge. Taking it would break the back of the Japanese defense, but it was also the most heavily defended position on the island. How do we get to it? Chen asked. I studied the approaches and realized there was only one way. We'd have to go straight up the face of the ridge, through the teeth of the Japanese defenses. It was going to be a suicide mission, but it was the only way to end this battle. We don't, I said finally. We're going to blow it up. The plan was simple but dangerous. We were going to pack a cave below the command post with explosives, then detonate them to bring down the entire coral formation. It would take tons of explosives, and somebody would have to get close enough to set the charges. I'll do it, Washington said immediately. I'm the demo man. You're the flamethrower operator, I corrected. I'm the squad leader, and this is my job. But before we could argue about it, Chen spoke up. Actually, Sarge, I think it should be me. I'm the radio man. I can coordinate the detonation from inside the cave. We all looked at him. Chen was the youngest member of the squad, barely 21. He'd been with us since Guadalcanal, and he'd never asked for anything except the chance to do his job. Chen, I started. No, Sarge, hear me out. You and Washington are combat veterans. The Corps needs experienced NCOs. I'm just a radio man. I'm expendable. Nobody is expendable, I said firmly. We all go in together or nobody goes in at all. In the end, that's what we did. The 3 of us, the last survivors of a squad that had started with 8 men, made our way up the coral face toward the Japanese command post. We carried enough explosives to bring down half the ridge, and we were prepared to die to make sure the job got done. The Japanese saw us coming when we were about halfway up the slope. Machine guns opened up from multiple positions, and bullets sparked off the coral around us. But we kept climbing, using every piece of cover we could find. There, Washington pointed to a cave entrance about 30 yards below the command post. We can get in there and set the charges. The cave was smaller than the others, probably used as a storage area or fighting position. But it was directly under the main command post, and it would be perfect for our purposes. Getting to the cave was the hardest part. The Japanese had clear fields of fire over the entire approach, and they were shooting at us with everything they had. We had to move by bounds, one man covering while the others moved. Go, I yelled, and Washington sprinted toward the cave entrance. Japanese bullets chewed up the coral around him, but he made it to cover. Then it was Chen's turn. The radio man was halfway to the cave when a Japanese sniper's bullet caught him in the leg. He went down hard, his radio scattering across the coral. But he kept moving, crawling toward the cave with his wounded leg dragging behind him. "Chen!" I screamed and started moving toward him. But Washington was already there, dragging the wounded radio man into the cave. "How bad?" I asked when I reached them. "I'll live," Chen gasped. "But I'm not going anywhere fast." I looked at the explosives we'd brought and realized we had a problem. The charges were set up to be detonated by radio signal, but Chen's radio was destroyed. "We'd have to find another way to set them off." "Timer fuses," Washington said. "We can set them for 5 minutes and get out of here." 5 minutes isn't enough to me to get clear," I said. "The whole ridge is going to come down." Washington shrugged. "Then we better find a deep hole to hide in." We set the charges throughout the cave, packing them into cracks and crevices in the coral walls. If our calculations were right, the explosion would bring down the entire coral formation above us. If we were wrong, we'd just waste a lot of explosives. "Timer's set," Washington said. "We've got 4 minutes." "Can you walk?" I asked Chen. The radio man struggled to his feet, favoring his wounded leg. "I can try." We made our way out of the cave and started down the coral face as fast as we could move. Behind us, the Japanese were still shooting, but they seemed to sense something was wrong. Their fire was becoming more desperate, more frantic. 3 minutes, Washington said. We were maybe 100 yards from the cave when the explosives went off. The explosion was enormous, far larger than anything we'd expected. The entire top of the ridge seemed to lift into the air, then come crashing down in a thunderous avalanche of coral and rock. The concussion knocked us all to the ground, and for a moment, I thought we were going to be buried alive. But when the dust settled and the debris stopped falling, we were still alive. Washington gasped. Did we just blow up the whole ridge? We had. The explosion had brought down the entire coral formation, burying hundreds of Japanese soldiers and destroying their main command post. The ridge that had held up the Marine advance for over a week was now a pile of rubble. "Chen, can you raise anybody on the backup radio?" I asked. The radio man tried his emergency radio and got a response immediately. "Regiment, this is Dragon 6. The ridge is down." "Repeat, the ridge is down." The voice that came back was filled with disbelief. "Dragon 6, confirm your last transmission." "Did you say the ridge is down?" "Affirmative, Regiment. The Japanese command post has been destroyed. The ridge is clear." There was a long pause then. "Outstanding work, Dragon 6. Outstanding work. The battle for Peleliu officially ended on November 27, 1944. 2 months and 12 days after we'd first landed on that coral hell. The island that was supposed to fall in 3 days had cost us over 11,000 casualties, including nearly 2,000 dead. But the Japanese had paid a higher price. Of the 11,000 soldiers who had defended Peleliu, fewer than 300 survived to be taken prisoner. The rest died in their coral caves, buried alive, or burned out one by one. Colonel Nakagawa himself committed suicide rather than surrender, taking his own life in the final days of the battle. I survived, along with Washington and Chen. We were 3 of the lucky ones, though luck had nothing to do with it. We'd survived because we'd learned to adapt, to think like the Japanese, to fight their kind of war. But the cost had been terrible. My original squad of 8 men had been reduced to 3. O'Brien was dead, killed by a Japanese grenade in the tunnel fighting. Kowalski had been evacuated with a shoulder wound and spent the rest of the war in a military hospital. Jenkins, Martinez, and the others were gone, their names added to the long list of Marines who died for 6 square miles of coral and rock. Was it worth it? Chen asked as we sat on the beach, waiting for the ship that would take us back to civilization. I looked out at the coral island that had been our home for 2 months. The Japanese had turned it into a fortress, and we'd turned it into a graveyard. Thousands of men had died fighting for a piece of land that had no strategic value, no resources, no importance except what military planners had given it. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but we did our job. We're Marines, and Marines don't quit." Washington nodded slowly. "The Japanese fought hard. Got to give them credit for that." He was right. The Japanese soldiers who had defended Peleliu had shown incredible courage and determination. They'd fought to the last man, died rather than surrender, and turned a simple amphibious assault into a 2-month nightmare. In many ways, they'd been better soldiers than we were, but we'd won. That was what mattered, what we told ourselves as we tried to make sense of the carnage. We'd won, and the Japanese had lost. The cost had been terrible, but victory was victory. "You know what I keep thinking about?" Chen said quietly. "That first day, when we thought it was going to be easy. When we thought we'd wrap it up in 3 days and move on to the next island. We were naive," I said. "We thought we understood this war, understood the Japanese. But we didn't understand anything." The war in the Pacific had changed after Peleliu. The Japanese had learned that they couldn't stop us from landing on their islands, but they could make us pay a terrible price for every yard of ground. The tactics they'd developed on Peleliu would be used again on Iwo Jima, on Okinawa, on every island we attacked for the rest of the war. "Do you think it will end soon?" Washington asked. I looked at the 2 Marines who'd fought beside me through hell and back. They were good men, brave men, and they deserved to go home to their families. But I had a feeling the war was far from over. "I don't know," I said. "But whatever happens, we'll face it together. We're Marines, and Marines take care of their own." The ship that took us off Peleliu was crowded with wounded Marines, men who'd paid the price for those 6 square miles of coral. Some were missing arms or legs. Others were just broken in ways that didn't show. All of them had the same look in their eyes, the look of men who'd seen too much, done too much, lost too much. As the island disappeared behind us, I tried to forget the things I'd seen and done. The Japanese soldiers I'd killed, the friends I'd lost, the 2 months of hell we'd endured. But I knew I'd never forget. Not really. Peleliu would stay with me for the rest of my life. "Hey, Sarge," Washington said as we stood at the ship's rail, watching the island fade into the distance. "You think anybody back home will understand what we went through?" I thought about that for a moment. How could you explain Peleliu to someone who'd never been there? How could you make them understand the heat, the coral, the smell of death that hung over everything? How could you tell them about the Japanese soldiers who'd fought and died with such incredible courage, or about the Marines who'd given their lives for a piece of rock in the middle of nowhere? "No," I said finally. "I don't think they will. But that's okay. We don't fight for the people back home to understand. We fight because it's our job and because the men next to us are counting on us." Chen nodded slowly. "The Japanese put up a hell of a fight. They never gave up, never surrendered. You got to respect that." I did respect it. The Japanese soldiers who'd defended Peleliu had shown incredible bravery and determination. They'd fought to the last man, died rather than surrender, and turned what should have been a simple operation into a 2-month nightmare. They'd been our enemies, but they'd also been soldiers, and they'd done their duty as they saw it. 11,000 Japanese soldiers, I said quietly. 11,000 men who died for their country, just like our men died for ours. "Think their families will ever know what happened to them?" Washington asked. I looked back at the island one last time. Somewhere under that coral, buried in caves and tunnels, were the bodies of thousands of Japanese soldiers. They'd died far from home, fighting a war they probably didn't understand any better than we did. Their families would never know exactly how they died, or where they were buried, or what their final moments were like. "I hope so," I said. "Everyone deserves to be remembered." The Battle of Peleliu was over, but the war went on. We'd learned hard lessons about Japanese tactics, about the cost of amphibious warfare, about the price of victory. The Japanese had shown us that they could make us pay in blood for every island we took, and that knowledge would shape the rest of the Pacific campaign. But we'd also shown them something. We'd shown them that Americans could adapt, could learn, could fight their kind of war when we had to. We'd taken their best shot and kept coming. We'd absorbed their punches and hit back harder. We'd proven that Marines don't quit, no matter how high the cost. As I write this, 60 years later, I can still see that Coral Island in my mind. I can still hear the sound of Japanese machine guns, still smell the cordite and death that hung over everything. I can still see the faces of the men who didn't make it home, O'Brien with his bar, Kowalski with his wide eyes, Jenkins and Martinez, and all the others. They were good Marines, good men, and they deserved better than to die on a piece of coral rock in the middle of nowhere. But they did their duty, and they did it with honor. They fought and died as Marines, and that's not nothing. That's something to be proud of. The Battle of Peleliu cost us 11,000 casualties and 2 months of hell. But it also showed us something important about ourselves, about what we were capable of when we had to be. We learned that we could adapt to any enemy, overcome any obstacle, survive any hell they threw at us. We learned that Marines don't quit. And sometimes, when the cost is high enough and the stakes are important enough, that's all that matters. We don't quit. We keep fighting, keep pushing forward, keep doing our job no matter what it costs us. That's what we did on Peleliu. That's what Marines do. Semper Fi.